We're here at the Henry George Gallery in Parkhurst, Johannesburg, having what promises to be an incredibly interesting conversation with Benjamin Skinner on his exhibition, Woolgathering. So, Ben, just tell us where the idea or the starting point for this exhibition originated.
Well, the way that I work tends to strongly revolve around creating an environment and then working within that environment with the people who are involved in shooting. So at one point there was a real interest in the idea of chinoiserie and the sort of interaction between a European or especially a French aesthetic and a Japanese aesthetic or Chinese aesthetic. I guess more Chinese in this regard. And the idea of that environment was built out of that. It wasn't necessarily an interpretation of that or a rendition of that. It was just the starting point. And then the environment grew to be visually something that I found interesting and exciting. I enjoy having a starting point, but that starting point isn't necessarily defining the outcome. And that runs through my work in general. My work is process-driven, not outcome-driven. I work with processes, I work with the way that I want to work. People say, what's your idea? Well, my idea is to have an experience. My idea is to start somewhere and see where we end up.
Yeah.
Let the process inform the outcome to a large extent, rather than a dogged attempt at hammering an outcome out of some possibly non-conforming ingredients.
Yeah.
I mean, a steak can't be a chocolate cake. They're both equally delightful, but they can't inhabit the same reality.
Yeah. All of this comes with a very, very particular sense of work ethic. And that runs rampant through the upstairs exhibition with the fact that you made the frames. Those boxes were made. And I come to visit a couple of times where he was sitting, cutting and making those boxes.
Yeah, they were a lot of work. There was a good few months' work involved in those, and I didn't have the time to entertain guests without working at the same point in time. So, if people were welcome to come over, but they'd end up sitting in my workshop whilst I was, planing wood down or chiseling out joints. And we made the six birchwood cabinets on those very thin legs. And they hold 6 works. All of the works have been hand-worked. So most of the works are multiple layered. So they're a layer of silk that's been printed on, old electrical insulation silk from I think probably the 20s or 30s. It was made in Great Britain. And some of the finest silk I've ever come across. It is so sheer, but incredibly perfect. And that was all then to some extent deconstructed around the edges on some of the works and kept quite neat on others, and all hand-stitched together. There's a funny thing that comes through with all of the works in this show, and they are very much like artifacts. The objects have become artifacts through their working. They've all been considered and worked as their own entities, so each one will be different. The display cabinets reinforce the idea of artifact. The broad borders around the small works reinforce the idea of artifact. The big tarpaulin that's draped out in one of the rooms on display also then further reinforces that idea of these artifacts were packed out of a crate, and this is the covering that remains.
And it also relates to the almost memory of process. The barrel of shavings from the planer, the pieces of wood that got left behind or that were reminiscent, the drawing of planning the boxes. That reinforces all of that, and again goes back to my idea of the memory, the trace.
Mm.
Because I think that, and I've heard from a couple of people that is so important to not necessarily understanding the show, but understanding the process.
I think process is inherently valuable. I do things largely in a non-premeditated manner. It's more responsive than that.
Mm.
I find things that I like and things that I feel are right. And the decision making is largely done from a guttural perspective. I kind of find something that feels correct, and then I run with it. And sometimes only years later do I realize why it felt correct. And I've learnt with time to stop trying to make decisions. Because every time I do try and force decisions and try and enforce that reality of a decision, it ends up creating a situation that is always a bit lackluster and doesn't quite reach the potential that I was hoping for. And when I just follow sort of the reality that needs to exist, the reality that sort of calls itself into being in some strange way, all the sort of coincidental sort of circumstances that compound themselves to create something that ends up being quite lovely. I get bored a lot, and I always get worried that I'm doing the same thing over and over again, so I tend to change direction quite a lot. I think there's a common thread, there's commonality that runs through it, but it does vary and it does change, and I do try to engage with new things. I try to undertake things that I find new and interesting, and hopefully that I think might intrigue other people. I mean, largely that's what my work's about, is some degree of sharing. I hope that everyone gets something out of my rampant expressioning.
But it's not just the sharing of your work. There's a whole bunch of other sharing that happens behind the background, which I know for a fact has an impact on a lot of people, and that's incredibly valuable, because it's not the art world or artist as insular. It's more about building community and connections.
I care about people. I want people to be happy, and I want people to be at peace. Themselves mostly. Because when you manage to achieve that, you really do have the ability to transcend most of the other shit fucking flowing around us. Just being at peace. Accepting the fact that we're all irrelevant and insignificant.
Yeah.
And that all we really need to do is try.
But thank you for this, and thank you for allowing me to be a participant.
Thank you for being part of the show. I really appreciate your time.
So,
And thanks for the chat. It's been great.
Brilliant. Thanks.